There was a witness in the house the night Margaret Voss was killed. She was 4 years old. She was asleep on the couch under a crocheted blanket, and when something woke her, she padded into the hallway and saw, through the gap in a doorway, a thing she did not have the words for and would not understand for 30 years. In the morning, the grown-ups asked her what she'd seen, and she said a sentence that no one believed and everyone soon forgot. Because she was 4, and 4-year-olds say things, and the detectives had real leads to chase. That one sentence was the truth. It would take 32 years, a grown woman's returning memory, and a single object she had carried her whole life without knowing why, to finally prove it. That is not a story about a case with no witnesses. That is a story about the one witness nobody could believe, and the 32 years it took the world to catch up to what a 4-year-old already knew. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to a farm town in northern Iowa in the winter of 1987. Because to understand what that child saw, you first have to understand the woman she lost. Coldwater, Iowa, in 1987 was a farm town on the flat black soil of the northern part of the state. Maybe 1,000 people. Grain elevators standing against the sky like the only mountains for 100 miles. There was a Lutheran church and a Catholic one. A cafe on Main Street that opened at 5 for the farmers, a co-op, and a hardware store. Winters came down hard and early off the prairie, and the snow drifted against the houses, and for months the world was white and silent and close. Everyone knew everyone. The same families had farmed the same sections for 4 generations. It was, people said, the kind of place where nothing ever happened, which is what people always say, right up until something does. Margaret Voss was 36, a farm wife and the bookkeeper for half the businesses on Main Street. A quick-witted, warm woman who could add a column of figures in her head and remember every child's birthday in town. She'd grown up in Coldwater, gone away to business college in Des Moines, and come back, one of the few who did, because she'd missed the big sky and the people who'd known her since she was small. She and her husband, Dale, farmed corn and soybeans on a place 3 miles out, and Margaret did the books for the co-op and the hardware store and several of the bigger farms, which meant she knew, better than almost anyone, exactly how much money moved through Coldwater and where it went. People trusted her with their numbers the way you trust a person who has never once given you a reason not to. She had a daughter, Katie, who was 4 that winter, a late and cherished child, born after years of the Vosses hoping. And she had a small habit her family loved. Every night she wound the brass key of an old mantel clock that had been her grandmother's, and she let Katie hold the key. And the winding of that clock was how the little girl knew it was time for bed. The clock's tick was the sound of the house being safe. You could hear it from the couch, under the crocheted blanket, as you fell asleep. On the night of February 9th, 1987, in the middle of a blizzard, the clock was wound at bedtime as always. By the next morning, Margaret Voss was dead, and the house would never feel safe to her daughter again. Here is what the grown-ups knew that morning. Dale Voss had been out before dawn, he said, trying to get to the cattle through the drifts, and had come back to find his wife dead in the home office where she kept the books, the filing drawers open, papers scattered. The phone line was down, not unusual in a blizzard. Their daughter Katie was on the couch under her blanket, awake, silent, her eyes very wide. When the sheriff finally got through the snow, the scene suggested someone had come for the records Margaret kept. A robbery, a break-in, a burglary gone wrong in the cover of the storm. The snow had erased any tracks. The blizzard had erased the time of death. And the only person who had been awake in that house, the only witness, was 4 years old. They asked Katie what she saw, she said. The man with the cold hands carried me back to the couch. That was all. A man with cold hands. The detectives wrote it down and set it gently aside, because a 4-year-old in shock, in a house full of strangers and grief, was not a witness any court would hear, and cold hands in the middle of a February blizzard could have meant anything or nothing. Within a week, the sentence was a footnote. Within a year, it was forgotten by everyone except the girl who'd said it. The investigator who caught the case was a sheriff's deputy named Ed Halverson, 38, a methodical man who'd grown up on a farm himself and kept a pair of his late father's work gloves on the seat of his patrol truck for reasons he never explained. He worked the burglary angle hard because that's what the scene told him. Margaret's bookkeeping meant she knew where money was, and a woman who knows where money is can become a target. But the leads went nowhere. No stolen goods ever surfaced. No outsider had been seen coming or going in a storm that had closed every road in the county. And there were 2 suspects in those early weeks, both of which collapsed. The first was a drifter who'd done day labor at the co-op that fall and left town owing money. The state traced him to Minnesota, snowed in at a motel 100 miles away the entire week. He couldn't have reached Coldwater through those drifts any more than anyone could have left it. A dead end. The second was harder and closer. Dale Voss himself, the husband, as the husband always is. But Dale had been seen by 2 neighbors struggling with his cattle in the worst of the storm at the hour the death likely occurred, and his grief was, by every account, total and genuine. He was never charged. He was also never quite cleared in the eyes of a town that needed someone to suspect, and he carried that shadow for the rest of his life. While Ed Halverson chased a burglar who seemed not to exist, 2 people lived the aftermath. Dale Voss raised his daughter alone on a farm where her mother had died. Under a quiet cloud of suspicion he could never fully escape, and he never remarried, and he never wound the grandmother's clock again. It sat stopped on the mantel for the rest of his life, its hands frozen at the time the battery had finally died, because he could not bring himself to touch it. And Katie Voss grew up in that house, with that stopped clock, carrying a sentence she'd said at 4 and a fear of cold hands she could not explain to anyone, including herself. The institutional failure here was subtle, and it was about belief. No one did anything corrupt. But the one witness to the crime was dismissed entirely because of her age, and her single true statement was never revisited as she grew old enough to be asked again. The system had no mechanism and no patience for a witness who would not be ready to testify for 30 years, so it simply closed the door on her and on what she knew. Then the case went cold, the way everything in Coldwater eventually went under the snow, slowly, completely, until you couldn't remember exactly where the road had been. By 1997, 10 years had passed. The Voss farm still ran. Dale still farmed it. The same sections his great-grandfather had broken. The stopped clock still sat on the mantel, dusted but never wound. Katie was 14 and had nightmares she didn't tell her father about, because he had enough sorrow of his own. She'd hear him some nights moving around the dark kitchen, not sleeping, and she learned to lie still. She had stopped letting friends come to the house because someone's mother had once said, not knowing Katie could hear, that they never had found out what really happened out at the Voss place. The town had long since folded Margaret Voss's death into its store of old tragedies. The bookkeeper killed in the blizzard of '87, a thing that happened once, long ago, that nobody ever solved, and that somehow still clung to the husband who survived it. By 2008, the cafe on Main Street had changed hands twice, and the new owners had never heard of Margaret Voss. The grain elevator she could see from her office window had been repainted, the co-op's old logo gone. Ed Halverson retired from the sheriff's department, and on his last day he photocopied the Voss file and took it home, the way the honest ones sometimes do, because a case with a child witness and no answer had never stopped itching at him. Dale Voss died in 2014 of cancer and, his daughter always believed, of 30 years of being half suspected of killing the wife he'd loved. A man who'd been cleared by no one and convicted by everyone, quietly, over coffee. Katie was 31 when she buried him. She came back to the farmhouse to sort through what he'd left. And there on the mantel was the stopped clock, its hands frozen, and the sight of it undid something in her she didn't understand. Every case we cover on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, court files, and the lives of people who deserve to be remembered. If you want us to keep telling these stories the way they ought to be told, take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. It honestly is what keeps this channel going. Now, let's get back to Katie, and to the night she'd spent 30 years trying not to remember. The case had been cold for 32 years when the witness everyone had dismissed finally became the witness who broke it open. After her father's death, Katie Voss, 31, a school teacher herself by then, living 2 states away, began having the nightmare more often, and she did something she had avoided her whole life. She went to a trauma therapist and started, carefully, to look at the night her mother died. Memory doesn't come back like a videotape. It came back to Katie in pieces, over months, the way a developing photograph rises out of the blank paper, the crocheted blanket, the cold, being lifted. And then, one afternoon, the piece that changed everything. The man who carried her back to the couch had worn a ring, a heavy class ring, and it had pressed cold against her cheek, and she had seen it up close in the hall light. A red stone and a shape stamped into the gold beside it, a shape she had drawn over and over as a child, without knowing why, and still drew in the margins of her lesson plans as an adult. A grain elevator, the logo of the Coldwater Farmers Co-op. Here is the truth of how this case broke, and there was no technology in it at all. The break was a human memory, finally given the time and safety to surface, in a mind that had been 4 years old and was now old enough to be believed. What Katie remembered was not proof, but it was a thread, and for the first time in 32 years, someone pulled it. Katie found Ed Halverson's name in her father's papers and called him. He was 79, and he had kept the file in his closet for 15 years. When she told him about the ring, the co-op class ring, the grain elevator stamp, the old man was quiet for a long moment because he remembered something that had meant nothing in 1987. The co-op had given commemorative rings in 1985 to the men on its board of directors. There had been only 9 of them. 9 men. One of them had had a key to everything Margaret Voss kept books for. One of them had known exactly what her records would show. Ed Halverson drove to the sheriff's office he'd retired from and laid it out for a young investigator who agreed to reopen the file. They pulled the co-op's old board records. They found that in the winter of 1987, the co-op had been quietly bleeding money, and that Margaret Voss, the bookkeeper, had, according to a co-op secretary still living, told a board member just days before she died that the numbers didn't add up and she intended to take them to the full board. They began looking hard at the 9 men who'd worn that ring, most of them now dead. One was very much alive. Lyle Brunner, 71, a retired and prosperous farmer, a former co-op board chairman, a deacon, and a fixture at the Main Street Cafe every morning of his life. In 1987, he had been the co-op's treasurer, the one man whose hand was deepest in the books Margaret Voss kept, and the one with the most to lose if she carried them to the board. He had not been hidden behind anything but a child's testimony being thrown away. For 32 years, his alibi had been the fact that the only person who could place him in that house had been 4 years old. The investigators built it carefully, because a recovered memory is not a conviction. They found that Lyle Broner's whereabouts during the blizzard, he'd claimed to be home alone, snowed in, had never been checked, because no one had ever suspected him. They found the co-op's 1986 books, preserved in a county archive, and an outside auditor confirmed that tens of thousands of dollars had been quietly diverted in exactly the period before Margaret's death by someone with the treasurer's access. And Katie Voss, in a recorded interview, described the class ring she'd seen at 4 years old in precise detail. The red stone, the grain elevator stamp, before she was ever shown a photograph of one. When she finally was shown the co-op's 1985 commemorative ring, she put her hand over her mouth and could not speak. Confronted with the books, the timeline, and a witness the years had finally made credible, Lyle Bruner, who had eaten breakfast at the same cafe for 50 years, gave it up in a flat voice. He had gone to the Voss farm in the storm to get the records before Margaret could take them to the board, certain the blizzard would hide him. He hadn't known the little girl was awake on the couch. When she woke, he said, he had carried her back and tucked the blanket around her, because, and this was the detail that sat coldest with everyone who heard it, he didn't want the child to be cold. Then he had gone home through the snow and let a town suspect a grieving husband for 30 years. When word went through Coldwater, the reaction ran the course it always does, and then something worse. Disbelief first. Not Lyle, not the man from the cafe, the deacon, the board chairman. Then a fury that had 2 targets. The man who'd done it, and the 32 years a whole town had spent quietly suspecting Dale Voss, an innocent widower who died under that shadow. Margaret's killer had let a good man be blamed his entire life rather than say a word. Lyle Bruner pleaded guilty in 2020 rather than make Katie testify in open court, and was sentenced to life. Margaret Voss's name was cleared of the burglary gone wrong story that had never fit. She was, it turned out, exactly what she'd always been. An honest woman who found a theft and meant to report it, and died for it. And Dale Voss, 3 years in his grave, was at last and publicly cleared of the suspicion he'd carried in silence, which his daughter said was the only part of the verdict that made her weep. Margaret Voss was 36 years old. She could add a column of figures in her head and remembered every child's birthday in town and wound her grandmother's clock every night so her daughter would know the house was safe. She died because she was honest in a town that trusted the wrong, honest-seeming man. The deputy who never stopped itching at a child's discarded sentence lived to hear that sentence proven true. The husband who was suspected for 30 years did not live to be cleared, which is its own quiet tragedy inside the larger one. And the 4-year-old on the couch, the witness no one could believe, grew up and carried a grain elevator ring in her memory for 3 decades, and in the end was the one who solved her own mother's murder. With nothing but a memory she was finally old enough to be trusted with. When Katie Voss went back to the farmhouse after the sentencing, she did one thing before she sold it. She took her great-grandmother's clock down off the mantel, the one that had sat stopped since the night her mother died, and she wound the brass key, the same key she'd held as a child, and she set the hands, and she let it tick. She said the house had not made that sound in 33 years, and that for a minute, standing there, it felt safe again. It makes you wonder. How many cases have a witness who simply wasn't believed? Too young, too frightened, too easy to dismiss, sitting on the truth for decades, waiting to be asked again. What does it cost a community to suspect the wrong person for 30 years? And can that ever truly be given back? And how much of what we call a cold case is really just a true thing that nobody was ready to hear? Tell us in the comments. Do you think a memory recovered after 30 years should be trusted? And what was it about Katie's that convinced you? What detail stayed with you most? The stopped clock, the cold hands, the ring against her cheek. And how many 4-year-old witnesses do you think have been quietly set aside over the years, holding answers no one came back for? Justice came for Margaret Voss after 32 years, carried there by the smallest witness anyone ever doubted. Stories like hers remind us that the truth can survive in the most unlikely keeper: a child's memory, a stopped clock, a ring pressed cold against a cheek, and that being believed, at last, is its own form of justice. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More solved cold cases are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.